You know that story about Van Halen and the brown M&Ms? Well, in case you haven't heard it, here's how it goes. When a band goes out on tour, they send each venue a list of stipulations and requests, and it's called a rider. And this includes things like the amount of voltage and amperage they're going to need, the weight of all their equipment so that the stage and the venue can handle it. But most famously in popular culture, it includes the things that the band wants to have backstage. You know, sometimes pretty innocuous things like water or snacks. It might include the kind of beer they want, how much, all those kinds of things. And there was a story that almost seemed like urban myth about Van Halen, that their rider included a stipulation that they wanted to have a bowl of M&Ms with all the brown ones removed backstage. And at the time, it was told as a story about runaway egos and rock and roll excess and all the stuff that these bands thought they could get away with and just mess around with. But years later, it came out that there was actually a reason for this. They were touring with this massive stage setup, and they were going all across the world, including venues that weren't necessarily used to these big, massive, technically demanding shows. And the idea was that if they got backstage and saw that there were no brown M&Ms in the bowl of M&Ms, they knew that that venue had paid attention to the rider, had checked off everything they needed to check off, and they knew everything was safe. But if they hadn't removed all the brown M&Ms, they knew they had to go over every detail with the venue to make sure it was okay. And there were some venues where apparently like a brand new floor collapsed, and so it became a safety issue. Now, whether or not that's true, or if the band was just trying to save face later in life, it's a really simple way to know that everything's been taken care of and you don't have to worry as much. Now, what does all that have to do with bartending and making cocktails? Let's find out. Happy New Year, everyone. I'm back with another home bartender video for bartenderatlas.com. Now, at this point, if you've been watching my videos for a while, you know all about Bartender Atlas. So, go over there and check out their site, read their profiles of bartenders from bars around the world, read their cocktail book reviews, their features. It's worth a look if you're interested in this topic. I've talked a little bit about technique before, but now I want to get a little more in-depth. And I want to talk about stirring, shaking, and then get into a little something different that's called actually throwing. When you're mixing a drink, and whether you're stirring it or shaking it or throwing it, you're doing three things. You're chilling the drink, you're adding that dilution, a little bit of water to round out the flavor, and you're adding some aeration. Obviously, stirring a drink is the least aggressive, so you're going to add the least aeration, and shaking is the most aggressive, so that's where you're going to add the most aeration. Stirring is also probably the most simple of the three. So, you get your mixing glass, and what you want to do is you want to add your ingredients first, then add your ice, and then what you do is you're holding the back of the spoon to the outside of the glass and kind of rotating it around. And what you're effectively doing is you're pushing the ice around, and then that's moving through the liquid and chilling and diluting the drink. You can do this a few different ways. I do it holding the spoon between my second and third finger, and it's kind of like a push and a pull around the glass. But recently I actually saw somebody do it interesting backhanded way, like that. I don't think it particularly matters. I do think pushing the ice around the glass is better than agitating it and getting it kind of aerated. When it comes to shaking, there are a couple of different vessels, right? There's you can have two things like this called a Boston shaker, or you can have this three-piece shaker. The technique's pretty similar either way. With a Boston shaker, you start with your smaller tin and you add your ingredients to that. Then you add your ice. Then you take your bigger tin and you put it on top. And what you're trying to get is sort of that one of these sides to kind of line up flat like this. And then I tend to turn it around, so I'm actually the smaller pieces now on the bottom, and kind of want to hold it like this. You're sort of cradling it in for me, my left hand, kind of like your non-dominant hand, and your other hand's kind of behind it. And rather than just moving back and forth, I like to think of the fluid moving around the ice almost in a circular motion. It's not just this aggressive back and forth, but you have this kind of rocking motion while going forward. It's exactly the same with this. It's a smaller shaker, but same kind of thing. Sort of cradling it and turn sideways so that you're kind of shaking kind of over your shoulder like this. Same kind of thing, holding it holding this, making sure everything's pushed together so that nothing, you don't spill. You don't want to do it like towards your guests, because if anything spills out, it's going to get all over them. So you kind of want to turn sideways and get it away from them like that. The one thing to consider is that this is a much smaller vessel. So if you filled that with ice all the way pretty much to the top, and then you put your lid on, that liquid is traveling a lot less as you're shaking it. But in here, everything's moving a lot more. So you're gonna get a lot more of that aeration and a lot more of that kind of lighter texture in your drink. Partially it's preference, you don't need to get both of these. If you're making a lot of drinks, you start to see the differences that these kinds of shakers make to different drinks. One additional piece on shaking is that if you're making a drink like a sour or a flip or something that has egg in it, you add all your ingredients to the shaker and then you shake before adding ice. So you put everything in the shaker, close up the shaker, shake really vigorously because you want to emulsify that. You want it to mix through everything, and that's a lot easier to do when it's warm before you add the ice and it gets cold. So you give it, it's called a dry shake, then take your top off, not your top off, this top off, and add the ice and continue shaking. The third way that may be less common is something called throwing. And for this, I'm gonna again use my Boston shaker, and you can use any kind of strainer, this kind of Hawthorne strainer, or I'm gonna use this julep strainer that I'm a big fan of. Once again, you add your ingredients to your small tin of your Boston shaker, you add your ice to it, and then you put your strainer on top like that, and then you're gonna pour the drink back and forth. And then you pour it back into the one with the ice in it. And I'm gonna stand up and show you that a little more. What you wanna do is you wanna start with the two glasses close to each other and high in the air. And then you start pouring and you move the bottom one away. And then you bring the top one down to meet it when it's about done. Now sure, that's a bit of like a showy, fancy kind of technique, and it looks really nice, and there's all that to it. And that's all true. But there's more to it than that. You're chilling the drink, you're adding dilution, but you're adding that air by separating those two tins, right? By doing this pour where you pour down and make that distance between the two longer and longer, is you are adding that lightness and aeration, but not as much as if you're shaking. And the drink that uses this technique that comes to mind for me is the Crusta, which is a great, fantastic sort of sour style drink, and it's traditionally prepared that way. But if you think that's a fun technique and you want to play around with it, you can try it with any drink you really want. I think it's a good technique to try with something like a martini. I made that video about how to make a martini, and I'll link that up here. Some people like their martini shaken, and they like that kind of lighter texture to it, and this imparts that. This adds a lot of chill, a lot more chill than I would have thought before I tried it myself. And it adds a little bit of that lightness. So for something like a martini, I think it could be really interesting, and so play around with it. Again, it's a little bit showy, but there is a reason that you're doing that separation between the tins, because it does add that texture to the drink. And it's another technique in your repertoire to bust out and share with your friends, and it's kind of fun. So what does that have to do with Van Halen and M&Ms? I think of all these technique things like that bowl of M&Ms with the brown ones removed. Whether it's the quality of the ingredients you use, whether it's the tools you prefer, or the technique that you use, I think caring about any one aspect shows how you care about all the others. In my last video, I talked about it's really easy to be, a mixologist or someone who makes drinks, and being a bartender is a whole other set of skills. And I think this starts to get to that as well, where you can read a recipe and mix those ingredients in the right proportions and swirl them around a glass with some ice and pour it back out into a glass, and it'll probably be fine. But if you take care of every step along the way, then I think it just makes a better end product. And if somebody either knows what you're doing and sees you do it, then they know that you're that they can recognize that. It's sort of like a shorthand, right? If you have somebody over and they're like, oh, that, the way that person is stirring looks really professional, then they'll trust the quality of your drinks. Or if they're just interested in how you're doing it, they may ask, and then that can spark conversation. And then again, they'll be impressed with the amount of care and thoughtfulness you put into every step of the drink. And I once showed somebody how I stir a drink, that the technique of the back of the spoon around the glass, and they're like, why does that matter? And it doesn't. Like I said, you could throw it all together just about any way you want. But I think this does elevate things from a simple mixed drink to a really fine cocktail. Yeah, it all comes back down to these little guys. So I don't know. Cheers is the right thing to say when you're about to eat an M&M? Why not? See you next time.